The glass doors of Whitmore, Sterling and Associates reflected the gray November sky as Maya Nakamura stepped from the hired car onto the polished granite steps. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the simple black dress that had cost her 2 weeks of careful budgeting. The law firm's towering presence in downtown's financial district spoke of old money and established power, the kind that had always made her feel small and out of place. I bet many of you watching have felt that same nervous energy walking into a place where you knew you didn't quite belong. Drop a comment and let me know what state or city you're watching from, and whether you've ever had to face a room full of people who made it clear you weren't welcome. 3 months had passed since Richard's sudden heart attack, 3 months of existing in a strange limbo where grief mixed with uncertainty about her future. The funeral had been a blur of polite condolences from faces she barely recognized, Richard's family maintaining their perfect masks of mourning while their eyes held nothing but cold assessment. Today would determine everything that came next. The elevator's soft chime announced each floor as it climbed toward the 32nd level. Maya watched the numbers climb and remembered her first time in this building, nearly 8 years ago, when Richard had brought her here to sign their prenuptial agreement. She had been so young then, so trusting, so eager to please his family who had made their disapproval crystal clear from the moment he introduced her as his fiancée. The receptionist's smile was professionally warm but distant as she directed Maya toward the conference room. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing in the vast lobby with its original oil paintings and fresh orchid arrangements that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The building itself was designed to intimidate, to remind visitors of their place in the established hierarchy. As she approached the frosted glass doors, Maya could already hear the familiar voices inside. Richard's mother, Patricia Whitmore, spoke in her clipped boarding school accent, the same tone she had used to inform Maya that the family would prefer a private ceremony, just family, as if Maya's presence somehow diminished the occasion. Richard's older brother James was there too, his voice carrying the same entitled confidence that had characterized every family gathering Maya had endured. Maya paused outside the door, gathering her courage. Through the translucent glass, she could see multiple figures already seated around what appeared to be a massive mahogany table. Richard had always promised that his family would come to accept her eventually, that their coldness was simply their way of protecting themselves from outsiders. After 8 years of marriage, Maya had learned that some promises were built on false hope. The security guard stationed near the conference room entrance looked up as she approached. His nameplate read Thompson, and his expression held a kind of professional neutrality that came from years of managing delicate family situations. Maya offered a small smile and stated her name, watching as he consulted his clipboard with deliberate care. She heard her name called from inside the room, though not in greeting. Patricia's voice carried clearly through the door as she spoke to someone else, her words sharp with disdain. Maya caught fragments of the conversation, enough to understand that her presence here was being questioned, debated, dismissed. The familiar knot formed in her stomach, the same feeling that had plagued her through countless family dinners and holiday gatherings where she remained perpetually on the outside. The door opened abruptly, and James Whitmore appeared, his tall frame filling the doorway. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair styled with the kind of precision that spoke of weekly appointments at exclusive salons. When his eyes met Maya's, she saw the same mixture of annoyance and superiority that had characterized their relationship since the day they met. James, Richard really should have been more careful about who he included in these arrangements. Patricia called from inside the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her opinions treated as facts. Some people simply don't understand the complexities of family business. The conference room itself was even more imposing than Maya had imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city below, while darkwood paneling and leather-bound law books created an atmosphere of solemn importance. The long table could have seated 20 people comfortably, though today only 6 chairs were occupied by members of Richard's family. Patricia Whitmore sat at the far end of the table, her silver hair pulled back in a severe chignon that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. She wore a black Chanel suit that probably cost more than Maya made in several months, and her jewelry caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. When she looked up at Maya's entrance, Her expression held the same cool disapproval that had never softened, even during Richard's final days in the hospital. Richard's sister Caroline sat to Patricia's right, her manicured fingers drumming impatiently against the leather portfolio in front of her. She had inherited the family's sharp features and sharper tongue, though she usually preferred to deliver her cruelty through subtle implications rather than direct confrontation. Her husband David occupied the chair beside her, his round face wearing the uncomfortable expression of someone who wished he were anywhere else. The youngest brother, Michael, sat across from Caroline with his wife Jennifer, both of them whispering quietly while casting occasional glances in Maya's direction. Michael had always been the most openly hostile of Richard's siblings, perhaps because he felt threatened by his older brother's success and needed someone to blame for his own shortcomings. Jennifer simply followed her husband's lead, though Maya suspected she harbored her own resentments about their family's position in the Whitmore hierarchy. As Maya stood in the doorway, she became acutely aware of the silence that had fallen over the room. 6 pairs of eyes studied her with varying degrees of hostility and dismissal, as if her presence somehow contaminated the sanctity of their family business. She had faced this same scrutiny countless times before, but today felt different, charged with insignificance she couldn't yet understand. Thompson, Patricia called to the security guard, her voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. I believe there's been some sort of mistake with the guest list today. This is a private family meeting, and I'm quite certain this person has no legitimate reason to be here. We'll need you to escort her out so we can proceed with our business. The security guard shifted uncomfortably, his eyes moving between Patricia's commanding presence and Maya's quiet dignity. Maya felt her face flush with the familiar heat of humiliation, the same feeling that had accompanied so many family gatherings where her presence was merely tolerated. She had hoped that Richard's death might soften their treatment, that grief might create some common ground between them, but their hostility seemed to have intensified rather than diminished. Mrs. Nakamura, Thompson said carefully, consulting his paperwork again. I do have you listed here for this appointment. Perhaps we should wait for the attorney to arrive and clarify the situation. Patricia's laugh was sharp and dismissive. The attorney will certainly clarify things, she said, her voice dripping with confidence. Some people seem to have developed very unrealistic expectations about their place in this family's affairs. 8 years of marriage doesn't automatically entitle someone to a seat at this table, especially when that marriage was clearly motivated by financial considerations from the very beginning. Maya felt the familiar sting of tears threatening, but she forced them back through years of practice. She had learned long ago not to give the Whitmores the satisfaction of seeing her break down, though the effort required tremendous strength she wasn't sure she still possessed. Richard had been her protector, her buffer against their cruelty, and without him she felt exposed and vulnerable in ways she had almost forgotten were possible. I have every right to be here, Maya said quietly, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Richard was my husband, and I believe I'm entitled to hear whatever arrangements he made. Caroline laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. Entitled, she repeated, savoring the word. How fascinating that someone in your position would use that particular word. Michael, didn't Richard mention something about a prenuptial agreement that specifically limited any claims on the family assets? Michael nodded eagerly, clearly pleased to have an opportunity to contribute to Maya's discomfort. Very comprehensive agreement, he said, his voice carrying false sympathy. Richard was quite thorough about protecting the family interests when he drew up those papers. I'm sure you remember signing them, though perhaps you didn't fully understand what they meant at the time. Maya remembered those papers very well, remembered the way Richard had apologized for their necessity while explaining that his family insisted on certain protections. She had signed them without argument, trusting that their love would transcend whatever legal boundaries his family felt they needed to establish. Now those same documents were being wielded against her like weapons designed specifically for this moment. The conference room door opened again, and Maya turned to see a tall man in an expensive gray suit entering with a leather briefcase and an air of quiet authority. This had to be the attorney, though something about his presence seemed to change the energy in the room in ways Maya couldn't immediately understand. The Whitmores straightened in their chairs, their expressions shifting from smug confidence to something more attentive and uncertain. The attorney who entered was not the elderly man Maya had expected, but someone closer to her own age with sharp, intelligent eyes and in presence that immediately commanded attention. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, and his charcoal suit spoke of the kind of success that came from handling the most complex and sensitive legal matters. When he looked around the room, his gaze lingered on Maya with what seemed like recognition, though she was certain they had never met. Patricia rose from her chair with the fluid grace of someone trained from childhood in proper social protocols. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, extending her hand with practiced charm. "Thank you for accommodating our family during this difficult time. I trust you understand the sensitive nature of today's proceedings and the importance of maintaining appropriate privacy." The attorney, Hawthorne, shook her hand politely, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "Mrs. Whitmore," he replied, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who chose his words with careful precision. "I understand this is indeed a sensitive matter, which is why it's essential that all parties named in the documentation be present before we begin." Patricia's smile faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly. "Of course," she said, gesturing toward the table where the family members sat in expectant silence. "Everyone who needs to be here is already assembled. I believe there may have been some confusion about the guest list, but we can certainly address that privately after our family business is concluded." James stood up from his position near the windows, his imposing height and expensive suit creating an intimidating presence as he moved toward Maya. His expression held the kind of cold determination that suggested he was prepared to handle what he considered an unpleasant but necessary task. Maya instinctively took a step backward, her heart rate increasing as she recognized the aggressive intent in his approach. "I think there's been enough confusion already," James said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his decisions accepted without question. "This woman has no business being in this room, and frankly it's insulting to Richard's memory to have her here pretending she belongs with his real family. We've tolerated this charade long enough." Maya felt her face burn with humiliation as James reached toward her arm, clearly intending to physically escort her from the room. The security guard Thompson shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about his role in what was becoming an increasingly volatile situation. Maya pulled back from James's reach, her quiet dignity warring with a growing sense of something that felt almost like anticipation, though she couldn't understand why. Caroline's voice cut through the tension with surgical precision. "Really, this is quite pathetic," she said, her manicured fingers tapping against the table in a rhythm that suggested barely controlled irritation. 8 years of marriage and she still doesn't understand that being legally married doesn't make someone family. Some people simply refuse to acknowledge their proper place in the social order. Michael nodded enthusiastically, seeming to gain confidence from his sister's cruelty. "Richard was always too soft-hearted for his own good," he added, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone finally able to speak what he considered truth. "We all knew this marriage was a mistake from the beginning, but he wouldn't listen to reason. Now we're left to clean up the mess and protect what our family built over generations." Jennifer joined the attack with the enthusiasm of someone eager to prove her loyalty to her adopted family. "It's really quite sad when you think about it," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Someone from her background probably never learned the difference between being a temporary guest and actually belonging somewhere. The cultural differences must make these situations so much more difficult to navigate properly. Maya felt the familiar crushing weight of their combined hostility, the same feeling that had plagued her through countless family gatherings where she had been tolerated rather than welcomed. But something was different today, something she couldn't quite identify that made their words feel less devastating than they once had. Perhaps it was grief that had numbed her to their cruelty, or perhaps something else entirely. Patricia moved closer, her presence radiating the kind of controlled authority that came from decades of commanding social situations. "My dear girl," she said, her voice adopting a tone of condescending kindness that was somehow more insulting than outright hostility. "I understand this must be very difficult for you, losing Richard and facing the reality of your situation. But continuing this pretense isn't helping anyone, least of all yourself. The older woman's perfectly applied makeup and expensive jewelry caught the afternoon light as she positioned herself directly in front of Maya, close enough that Maya could smell her subtle but undoubtedly costly perfume. Patricia had perfected the art of delivering cruelty through apparent kindness, a skill that made her attacks particularly devastating because they were so difficult to challenge directly. You must understand that Richard's family has certain obligations and responsibilities that extend far beyond personal relationships, Patricia continued, her voice maintaining its deceptively gentle tone. The business interests, the family foundation, the various charitable commitments we've maintained for generations. These are complex matters that require a deep understanding of how established families operate. Maya listened to the familiar litany of exclusions, the careful way Patricia enumerated all the important family business from which Maya had always been excluded. She had heard variations of this speech many times over the years, usually delivered with the same combination of false sympathy and absolute certainty that Maya could never truly understand or contribute to anything that mattered. David, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up from his position beside Caroline. Perhaps it would be easier for everyone if we simply explained the practical realities, he suggested, his voice carrying the nervous energy of someone uncomfortable with confrontation but unwilling to oppose the family consensus. The prenuptial agreement was quite specific about limiting any claims on family assets, and I believe there were also provisions about confidentiality regarding family business matters. Thompson, the security guard, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the family's attacks intensified. Maya could see him glancing between his paperwork and the aggressive posturing of the Whitmore family, clearly uncertain about how to proceed in such a delicate situation. His professional training had probably prepared him for many scenarios, but navigating the complex dynamics of wealthy family disputes was likely outside his normal experience. Caroline laughed, a sound that managed to be both musical and cruel. Confidentiality provisions, she repeated with obvious amusement. How thoughtful of Richard to anticipate that some people might not understand the importance of discretion when it comes to family matters. Though I suppose when someone marries primarily for financial security, they might not fully appreciate the complexities involved. The attacks were coming faster now, each family member contributing their own particular brand of cruelty to what had become a coordinated assault on Maya's right to be present. Maya found herself thinking about all the family dinners where she had endured similar treatment, all the holiday gatherings where she had been made to feel like an unwelcome guest in her own husband's family. But something strange was happening as she listened to their familiar complaints and accusations. Instead of the crushing defeat she usually felt in these moments, Maya found herself noticing details she had never observed before. The way Patricia's confidence seemed slightly forced, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as everyone else. The nervous energy underlying James's aggressive posturing, as if his certainty might be hiding some deeper uncertainty. Mr. Hawthorne, who had been observing the family dynamics with professional interest, finally spoke again. I appreciate everyone's concerns about privacy and family matters, he said, his voice cutting through the rising hostility with quiet authority. However, I must insist that we follow proper legal protocols in these proceedings. All parties named in the relevant documents have a right to be present during the reading. Patricia turned toward the attorney with the kind of smile she reserved for people she needed to manage carefully. Of course we want to follow all proper procedures, she said, her voice maintaining its practiced charm while her eyes remained cold. I simply want to ensure that we don't waste everyone's valuable time on matters that don't require the presence of, shall we say, peripheral parties. Surely a woman of her background would be more comfortable handling these matters through separate, more appropriate channels. The attorney's expression remained unchanged, though Maya thought she detected something that might have been amusement in his eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, he replied with careful precision, I believe you may find today's proceedings somewhat different from your expectations. The documentation I have here contains several provisions that may surprise all parties involved. James moved closer to Maya again, his presence clearly intended to intimidate her into leaving voluntarily. Look, he said, his voice dropping to what he probably considered a reasonable tone. Nobody wants to make this more difficult than it needs to be. Why don't you just accept reality and save yourself the embarrassment of being formally removed from a proceeding where you clearly don't belong? Maya looked up at James's imposing figure and felt something shift inside her, something that had been building throughout this ordeal but was only now becoming clear. For years, she had allowed these people to define her worth, to make her feel small and insignificant in the face of their inherited privilege and social position. But standing here now, facing their coordinated cruelty, she found herself remembering things they had apparently forgotten. "I believe I'll stay," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying a steadiness that surprised even her. "Richard was my husband, and I have every right to hear what provisions he made. If you're so certain those provisions don't concern me, then you should have no objection to my presence during the reading." The room fell silent for a moment, the family members clearly taken aback by Maya's refusal to be intimidated. They had grown accustomed to her quiet acceptance of their treatment, her willingness to defer to their superior knowledge and social position. This unexpected resistance clearly caught them off guard and seemed to increase their determination to assert their authority. Patricia's mask of polite concern finally slipped, revealing the steel underneath. "Very well," she said, her voice now carrying the sharp edge of someone whose patience had been exhausted. "If you insist on making this difficult, then perhaps it's time you learned exactly where you stand in this family's hierarchy. Thompson, I believe we need to make it clear that this woman is not welcome here and needs to be removed immediately." Thompson looked helplessly between Patricia's commanding presence and Maya's quiet determination, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Before he could respond, Mr. Hawthorne cleared his throat with the kind of authority that immediately drew everyone's attention back to him. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality that suggested the discussion was over, "I believe we should begin the proceedings now that all the required parties are present. If everyone would please take their seats, we can address any questions about participation as we review the relevant documents." Maya felt a strange sense of anticipation as she moved toward an empty chair, ignoring the hostile stares of the Whitmore family members. Something in the attorney's manner suggested that the afternoon held surprises that none of them, herself included, were fully prepared for. The conference room settled into an uncomfortable silence as Mr. Hawthorne arranged his papers with deliberate precision. Maya found herself seated at the far end of the massive mahogany table, positioned almost like an afterthought, while the Whitmore family members clustered together in what appeared to be their natural formation. The attorney's briefcase clicked open with the sound of expensive hardware, and he withdrew a thick folder sealed with the kind of formal legal ribbons that suggested documents of significant importance. Patricia had recovered her composure with the speed that came from years of social training, though Maya noticed a slight tension around her eyes that hadn't been there earlier. The older woman smoothed her Chanel jacket and folded her hands in her lap with practiced elegance, clearly preparing to receive what she undoubtedly expected would be confirmation of her family's continued financial security and social position. James remained standing near the windows, his imposing frame silhouetted against the city skyline as he watched the proceedings with barely concealed impatience. His earlier aggression toward Maya had transformed into something more like smug anticipation, as if he were simply waiting for the formalities to conclude so he could personally oversee her removal from both the building and their lives. "Before we begin, Mr. Hawthorne said, his voice carrying the measured authority that comes from decades of handling complex family matters, "I want to ensure that everyone understands the binding nature of the documents we'll be reviewing today. These arrangements were carefully crafted over several years and represent Mr. Richard Whitmore's final wishes regarding the disposition of his considerable assets." Caroline leaned forward slightly, her manicured fingers drumming against the leather portfolio she had brought with her. "I'm sure we all appreciate Richard's attention to detail," she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the family hierarchy. He was always so thoughtful about ensuring the family's interests were properly protected for future generations. Michael nodded enthusiastically, clearly eager to demonstrate his agreement with whatever arrangements had been made. Richard understood the importance of maintaining family unity and ensuring that our various business interests remained under appropriate management. He added, shooting a meaningful glance toward Maya that suggested such management certainly didn't include anyone outside their bloodline. The attorney acknowledged their comments with a professional nod before turning his attention to the formal documents. The last will and testament of Richard Alexander Whitmore, he began, his voice taking on the ceremonial tone required for such proceedings. Dated March 15th of this year, properly witnessed and notarized according to all applicable legal requirements. Maya felt a strange flutter in her stomach at the mention of the date. March 15th had been just 6 months ago, long after she and Richard had been married, long after she had supposedly been excluded from all significant family business. She wondered why Richard had felt the need to update his will so recently, and what changes might have prompted such timing. Mr. Hawthorne's eyes scanned the documents as he continued reading. To my beloved mother, Patricia Whitmore, I leave the sum of $500,000, along with the contents of the family safe deposit box, in recognition of her lifelong dedication to our family's welfare and her invaluable guidance throughout my business career. Patricia's face lit up with satisfaction, though she maintained the dignified composure appropriate for such solemn proceedings. The amount was generous without being excessive, exactly what she might have expected from a son who understood both family obligations and proper financial planning. Maya watched as the older woman exchanged meaningful glances with her other children, their expressions reflecting shared relief that Richard had honored traditional family hierarchies. To my brother James, Mr. Hawthorne continued, I leave my collection of vintage automobiles, currently housed at the Riverside facility, along with the sum of $300,000 to ensure their proper maintenance and storage. James has always shared my appreciation for fine engineering and will understand the care these vehicles require. James's face broke into the first genuine smile Maya had seen from him all day. The car collection represented not just monetary value, but also recognition of his particular interests and his position as Richard's older brother. Maya knew that James had always felt somewhat overshadowed by Richard's business success, and this bequest seemed to acknowledge his importance within the family structure. To my sister Caroline and her husband David, the attorney read, I leave the beach house in the Hamptons, along with all furnishings and contents, plus the sum of $400,000. Caroline has always been the heart of our family gatherings, and I know she will ensure this property continues to serve as a place where our family can come together. Caroline's eyes actually filled with tears, though whether from genuine emotion or relief at receiving such a substantial inheritance, Maya couldn't tell. The beach house was worth several $1 million on its own, and the additional cash would ensure Caroline and David's financial security for the rest of their lives. Maya remembered the many summer gatherings at that house where she had been tolerated but never truly welcomed, always made to feel like a guest rather than family. To my youngest brother Michael and his wife Jennifer, Mr. Hawthorne continued, I leave my interest in the downtown office building, along with the responsibility for managing the commercial leases and the sum of $350,000 to facilitate that management. Michael's business acumen has always impressed me, and I trust him to handle these responsibilities with the care they deserve. Michael practically glowed with pride at the recognition of his business skills, something he had clearly craved throughout his relationship with his more successful older brother. The office building represented steady income and significant prestige, exactly the kind of legacy that would establish Michael's importance within the family's financial empire. Jennifer squeezed her husband's hand, her face reflecting their shared excitement about their elevated status. Maya listened to these bequests with growing confusion and something that felt almost like relief. Each family member was receiving exactly what they might have hoped for, generous amounts that reflected both their expectations and their positions within the family hierarchy. Perhaps Richard had simply included her out of legal necessity, maybe a modest sum to satisfy the requirements of their prenuptial agreement. The attorney paused in his reading, taking a sip of water from the crystal glass that had been placed at his elbow. The Whitmore family members sat in satisfied silence, clearly pleased with Richard's recognition of their individual contributions and their collective importance. Maya found herself wondering if she had misunderstood her own position, if perhaps her presence here was merely a formality before she received some small token amount and disappeared from their lives forever. Mr. Hawthorne's eyes moved around the table, lingering for a moment on each family member before settling on Maya with what she thought might be particular attention. The afternoon lights streaming through the conference room windows had shifted, casting different shadows across the polished table surface and creating an almost theatrical atmosphere for whatever was to come next. Thompson, the security guard, had positioned himself near the door, but Maya noticed his posture had changed subtly since the reading began. He no longer seemed focused on the potential need to escort her from the building. Instead, he appeared to be paying careful attention to the attorney's words, as if something in the proceedings had captured his professional interest. Patricia cleared her throat delicately, the sound drawing everyone's attention back to her composed figure at the head of the table. "I think we can all agree that Richard showed excellent judgment in these arrangements," she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose expectations had been completely fulfilled. He clearly understood the importance of keeping family assets within the family and ensuring that each of us can continue to uphold the standards he worked so hard to establish. James nodded approvingly from his position by the windows. "This is exactly what we hoped to see," he said, his earlier hostility toward Maya now replaced by the magnanimous confidence of someone whose position had been validated. Richard always understood that family loyalty and business acumen go hand in hand. These bequests reflect his appreciation for the people who really contributed to his success. Caroline smiled warmly at her brothers, the kind of genuine expression that Maya rarely saw from her during family gatherings. "I'm so relieved that everything is being handled exactly as it should be," she said, her voice carrying heartfelt emotion. Richard was always so thoughtful about ensuring everyone's future was secure, and these arrangements show his deep understanding of what each of us brings to the family. Maya felt increasingly isolated as she watched the family's celebration of their good fortune. Their relief was palpable, their satisfaction complete, and their unity stronger than ever in the face of what they clearly considered a successful conclusion to a potentially difficult situation. She began to wonder why Mr. Hawthorne had insisted on her presence if these were the only significant bequests in Richard's will. Michael leaned back in his leather chair, his face reflecting a contentment that Maya had never seen from him before. The responsibility for the office building represented more than just financial reward. It was recognition of his capabilities and his rightful place in the family's business operations. This was the kind of inheritance that would allow him to hold his head high at family gatherings, to contribute meaningfully to their collective success. Mr. Hawthorne returned to his documents, his fingers turning through several pages with what seemed like careful deliberation. The family members watched him with the relaxed attention of people who had already received what they wanted and were simply waiting for the formalities to conclude. Maya sensed their growing impatience with whatever remained to be read, their eagerness to begin celebrating their good fortune and planning their futures. The attorney's expression remained professionally neutral, though Maya thought she detected something in his manner that suggested the proceedings were far from over. There was a precision to his movements, a careful attention to timing that seemed inconsistent with someone simply wrapping up routine business. Thompson had moved closer to the table, though he maintained his respectful distance from the family's private affairs. Patricia glanced at her watch, a delicate Cartier piece that had probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. "I hope we can conclude these formalities soon," she said, her voice carrying the polite impatience of someone with important social obligations. "We have arrangements to make regarding memorial services and family gatherings, and I'm sure everyone is eager to begin processing these generous provisions Richard has made." The afternoon sun had shifted enough that the conference room's lighting had changed, creating longer shadows and a different quality of illumination that seemed to add weight to whatever was coming next. Maya found herself noticing details she had missed earlier. The way Mr. Hawthorne's expensive suit was perfectly tailored, the quality of his leather briefcase, the confident way he handled documents that clearly represented years of careful legal planning. "Actually, Mrs. Whitmore," the attorney said, his voice carrying a note that suggested their afternoon was about to take an unexpected turn. "We're approaching the most significant portion of today's proceedings. The bequests we've just reviewed represent only a small fraction of Mr. Whitmore's total estate. The bulk of his assets, including his business interests, investment portfolio, and primary residence, are addressed in the following provisions." The family's satisfied expressions began to shift as the implications of his words became clear. Maya felt her heart rate increase as she realized that whatever came next would determine not just her own future, but apparently the futures of everyone seated around this imposing table. File edit. Chapter_4.txt adding more content to Chapter 4 to reach the required 15,000 characters by expanding the revelation and family reactions old content. Mr. Hawthorne reached for another folder, this one even thicker than the first. Perhaps it would be helpful to review some of the specific documentation regarding Mrs. Nakamura's contributions to the family's financial success, he suggested, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had more revelations yet to deliver. The records are quite comprehensive and should clarify any remaining questions about the legitimacy of these arrangements. New content. Mr. Hawthorne reached for another folder, this one even thicker than the first. Perhaps it would be helpful to review some of the specific documentation regarding Mrs. Nakamura's contributions to the family's financial success, he suggested, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had more revelations yet to deliver. The records are quite comprehensive and should clarify any remaining questions about the legitimacy of these arrangements. Caroline was shaking her head frantically, as if physical motion could somehow undo what they had just learned. This can't be real, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own rapid breathing. We've known her for 8 years. We would have noticed if she was some sort of financial genius. Someone would have said something. Someone would have told us the truth about who she really was. Maya felt a strange sense of liberation as she watched the family's carefully constructed assumptions about her crumble in real time. For years, she had absorbed their subtle and not-so-subtle insults about her intelligence, her background, her worthiness to be part of their social circle. Now they were learning that their entire fortune, everything they had assumed belonged to them by birthright, had actually been created by the woman they had dismissed as insignificant. Michael suddenly stood up from his chair, his face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of embarrassment and rage. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "If this is all true, if she really is some sort of business mastermind, then why did she marry Richard in the first place? Why would someone with those kinds of credentials and earning potential settle for being a housewife unless she was planning some sort of elaborate con game?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Maya felt the familiar sting of their assumption that any relationship between her and Richard must have been based on calculated manipulation rather than genuine affection. Even faced with irrefutable evidence of her professional capabilities, they couldn't accept that Richard might have simply fallen in love with a woman who happened to be brilliant. Mr. Hawthorne's expression showed the first sign of what might have been disapproval as he listened to Michael's accusations. "According to the personal correspondence I've reviewed," he said, his voice carrying a sharp edge that hadn't been there before, "Mr. Whitmore and Mrs. Nakamura met at a Columbia University alumni event in 2014. Their relationship appears to have developed naturally over several months of mutual professional respect and personal attraction." James was staring at Maya, as if seeing her for the first time, his eyes taking in details he had apparently never noticed during their years of family interactions. "You were at Columbia," he said slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made sense when spoken aloud. "You have an MBA from Columbia, and we never knew. Richard never told us, and you never mentioned it. Not once in 8 years of family dinners and business discussions." Maya met his gaze steadily, feeling a strength she had forgotten she possessed flowing back into her voice and posture. "I mentioned it several times, actually," she replied, her tone carrying the quiet authority of someone stating simple facts. "The first time was at our engagement dinner, when your mother asked about my background. I told her about my education and my work at Goldman Sachs. She changed the subject to wedding planning and never brought it up again." Patricia's face was a mask of confusion and what might have been the beginning of genuine fear. "I don't remember that conversation," she said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Surely if someone had mentioned Goldman Sachs and Columbia, I would have remembered such important information. Why would I forget something so significant about my son's fiancée?" The attorney cleared his throat gently, drawing attention back to the documents spread across the table. According to the partnership records, Mrs. Nakamura's initial contribution to Meridian Holdings included not only her professional expertise, but also approximately $2.3 million in personal savings and investments that she brought into the partnership when it was formed. The number struck the assembled family members like a physical blow. They had spent years assuming that Maya had brought nothing to her marriage with Richard except whatever modest background she came from. The idea that she had actually contributed millions of her own money to their joint venture was so far outside their assumptions that they seemed unable to process it. Caroline's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. She had over $2 million of her own money? But how is that possible? She was working as an analyst, not a managing director. How does someone that young accumulate that kind of wealth unless they inherited it or got it through some sort of questionable means? Maya felt the last restraints of politeness and family harmony finally falling away as she listened to their continued attempts to diminish her accomplishments. She leaned forward in her chair, fixing Caroline with a direct stare that made the other woman visibly uncomfortable. "I made that money the same way anyone makes money on Wall Street," she said, her voice carrying an edge of steel that none of them had ever heard from her before. "I was very good at my job. I worked 100-hour weeks for 3 years, and I invested my bonuses wisely in markets that I understood better than most people." Thompson had positioned himself more directly behind Maya's chair, his body language clearly indicating that he now understood who in this room actually deserved his protection and respect. The complete transformation of power dynamics was something he had witnessed in other high-stakes family meetings, and his professional instincts had obviously adjusted to the new reality. James was holding his head in his hands, the magnitude of their misjudgment apparently beginning to overwhelm him. 8 years, he muttered, his voice muffled by his palms. 8 years we've been treating her like she was some sort of charity case Richard took pity on. And all this time, she was the one making the money that paid for our beach house and our cars and our country club memberships. Patricia suddenly straightened in her chair, her face showing the first signs of genuine panic as the implications became clear. "If she owns $46.5 million worth of assets," she said slowly, as if afraid to voice the thought, "then what does that mean for the rest of us? What happens to our lifestyle, our social position, our ability to maintain the standards we've always known?" Mr. Hawthorne looked up from his documents with an expression that suggested they had reached the most crucial part of the afternoon's proceedings. "That's actually addressed quite specifically in the final provisions of Mr. Whitmore's will," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that would reshape multiple lives. "Perhaps we should review those arrangements now that everyone understands the actual distribution of assets and the legitimate ownership of the estate in question." Mr. Hawthorne opened the thick folder with ceremonial deliberation, revealing what appeared to be hundreds of pages of official documents, financial statements, and legal correspondence. The afternoon lights streaming through the conference room windows seemed to illuminate the papers with an almost theatrical intensity as he began laying them out across the mahogany table in precise, methodical arrangements. "These are the quarterly reports for Meridian Holdings covering the 8-year period from 2016 through this year," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of irrefutable documentation. "Each report bears Mrs. Nakamura's signature as managing partner and chief investment officer, along with detailed analysis of the strategies she implemented to achieve the growth we discussed earlier." Maya watched as the family members leaned forward to examine the documents, their faces reflecting a mixture of desperate hope that somehow the evidence might be flawed and growing dread as they began to comprehend the scope of what they were seeing. Page after page of financial records, all bearing her distinctive signature, all documenting decisions that had generated millions of dollars in returns for the partnership. Caroline reached for one of the reports with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the dense columns of numbers and projections as if she might find some error that would invalidate everything they had learned. Her face grew progressively paler as she read, and when she finally looked up, her expression held the hollow shock of someone whose entire worldview had been systematically dismantled. "This shows that she predicted the technology sector rally of 2018, Caroline said, her voice barely audible. "The projections here indicate she moved our investments into emerging markets 6 months before the major gains began. How did she know to make these moves when most of Wall Street was caught completely off guard?" Mr. Hawthorne nodded approvingly, as if Caroline had asked exactly the right question. "According to these records, Mrs. Nakamura's investment philosophy combined traditional market analysis with what she called demographic trajectory modeling. She studied global population trends, technological adoption patterns, and resource allocation shifts to identify opportunities that traditional analysts were overlooking. James had picked up another set of documents, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to process what he was reading. These show massive returns on investments in renewable energy companies starting in 2017, he said, his voice filled with something approaching awe. She was buying into solar and wind technology when most people still thought those industries were speculative risks. The returns here are absolutely staggering. Maya felt a strange satisfaction watching them finally understand the scope of her professional capabilities, the same capabilities they had dismissed and ignored for years while she sat quietly through family business discussions. Every condescending comment about her inability to understand complex financial matters, every suggestion that she should leave the important decisions to people who actually knew what they were doing, now stood revealed as willful ignorance of her actual qualifications. The attorney continued his methodical presentation, placing additional documents across the table with the precision of someone building an unassailable case. These communications show the regular correspondence between Mrs. Nakamura and the major investment firms that handled Meridian Holdings accounts, he explained. As you can see, all significant financial decisions were made based on her analysis and recommendations. Michael grabbed a stack of emails, his face reflecting desperate hope that he might find some indication that Maya had been merely following Richard's instructions rather than leading their investment strategy. His expression crumbled as he read through message after message bearing Maya's detailed analysis and Richard's responses acknowledging her expertise and thanking her for her insights. This email from Richard says he's completely out of his depth with the emerging markets analysis, Michael read aloud, his voice carrying the strain of someone forced to confront uncomfortable truths. He's asking her to handle all decisions related to international investments because he trusts her judgment more than his own. This is dated just 2 years after their marriage. Patricia had been studying a series of bank statements with the intense focus of someone searching for any possible escape from an impossible situation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of its usual authority, replaced by something that sounded almost like pleading. Surely these documents can't tell the complete story, she said. Richard must have been involved in the major decisions. He was always so proud of his business acumen, always talking about his successful investments at family gatherings. Mr. Hawthorne's expression remained professionally neutral, though Maya thought she detected a note of something that might have been pity in his voice when he responded. According to the documentation, Mr. Whitmore's primary contribution to the partnership involved client relations and business development, while Mrs. Nakamura handled all aspects of investment strategy and portfolio management. The division of responsibilities was quite clear and apparently worked very effectively for both partners. Thompson had moved even closer to Maya's chair, his position now making it clear to everyone in the room that he understood exactly who deserved his professional protection. The security guard's transformation from potential escort to protector represented a microcosm of the larger power shift that was taking place around the conference table. Caroline suddenly looked up from the documents she had been studying, her face reflecting a new level of horrified understanding. These records show that our family's trust funds have been managed through Meridian Holdings for the past 5 years, she said, her voice rising with something approaching panic. The money that's been supporting our lifestyle, paying for our houses and cars and country club memberships, it's all been generated by her investment decisions. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence, forcing each family member to confront the reality that their comfortable existence had been entirely dependent on the financial expertise of the woman they had spent years treating as an unwelcome outsider. Maya watched their faces as the full implications became clear, saw the moment when each of them realized that their previous cruelty had been directed toward their own benefactor. James was holding his head in his hands again, his voice muffled but audible as he spoke. The beach house renovations last year, he said slowly. The new cars Caroline and David bought, Michael's office expansion, even Mother's charitable donations to the symphony. All of that money came from investments that she made, decisions that she was responsible for while we were telling her she didn't understand how successful families handle their finances. Mr. Hawthorne reached for yet another folder, this one bound with red ribbon that suggested documents of particular legal significance. These are the corporate records for all the subsidiary companies that were created to manage the various investment portfolios, he announced. Mrs. Nakamura is listed as the president and chief executive officer of each entity, with Mr. Whitmore serving as chairman of the board and public representative. Maya remembered the countless hours she had spent in Richard's home office, analyzing market trends and preparing investment strategies while his family gathered in other parts of the house, discussing business matters they assumed were too complex for her to understand. She had signed incorporation papers, filed regulatory documents, and made decisions that affected millions of dollars while they debated whether she was intelligent enough to contribute to conversations about family finances. Patricia's composure finally cracked completely as she began to understand the true scope of their dependence on Maya's expertise. "You mean to tell me," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "that every major financial decision that's affected our family for the past 8 years has been made by someone we've been treating like an unwelcome guest at our own table?" Michael suddenly stood up from his chair, his face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of humiliation and desperate anger. "This has to be some sort of elaborate fraud," he declared, his voice carrying the frantic energy of someone grasping for any possible alternative to accepting reality. Nobody could have hidden this level of involvement for so long without someone noticing. There has to be some explanation that doesn't make us look like complete fools. The attorney's expression showed the first sign of genuine disapproval as he responded to Michael's accusations. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying a sharp edge that made everyone in the room pay attention, "the documentation I'm presenting today has been reviewed and verified by 3 independent accounting firms and 2 forensic financial analysts. The legitimacy of these arrangements is beyond question, and any suggestion of fraud is both incorrect and potentially actionable." Thompson had positioned himself more directly behind Maya's chair, his body language making it clear that he would not tolerate any aggressive behavior directed toward her from any member of the family. The complete reversal of his protective instincts represented the most visible symbol of how dramatically the power dynamics in the room had shifted. Caroline was frantically shuffling through documents, apparently hoping to find some evidence that might mitigate the scope of their misjudgment. When she finally looked up, her face reflected the hollow expression of someone who had been forced to confront the complete inadequacy of her own understanding. "How did we not know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did we spend 8 years completely misunderstanding who she was and what she was capable of?" Maya felt the last vestiges of her former deference finally disappearing as she looked around the table at people who had shaped her understanding of her own worth for nearly a decade. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that seemed to surprise even her with its strength and clarity. "You didn't know because you never asked," she said, her words cutting through their shock with surgical precision. "You made assumptions based on my appearance and my background, and when those assumptions were challenged, you dismissed the evidence rather than reconsider your conclusions. Every time Richard tried to explain my role in our business, you changed the subject. Every time I offered insights during family discussions, you found ways to minimize or ignore what I said." The silence that followed her words was so complete that the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant murmur of traffic from the street below. Maya had finally spoken the truth that had been building inside her for years, and the weight of that truth seemed to settle over the conference room like a heavy blanket. Mr. Hawthorne closed the final folder with the same deliberate precision he had used throughout the afternoon, the sound echoing in the conference room with a finality that seemed to settle the matter completely. The documents spread across the mahogany table told an irrefutable story of professional competence, financial genius, and years of quiet contribution to a family fortune that had been built on Maya's expertise rather than the inherited privilege the Whitmores had always assumed was their birthright. Maya rose from her chair with a fluid grace that seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including herself. For 8 years she had occupied the margins of family gatherings, accepting their casual dismissals and condescending explanations of matters she understood better than any of them. Now she stood at the head of the conference table with the quiet authority of someone who finally understood her own worth. Patricia was the first to break, her carefully maintained composure cracking completely as the reality of their situation became undeniable. "Maya, dear," she said, her voice carrying a desperation that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. "Surely we can discuss this situation like reasonable people. There must be some arrangement we can make that recognizes both your contributions and the family's legitimate interests in maintaining our traditional relationships." The plea hung in the air between them, and Maya felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and something that might have been pity as she looked at the woman who had spent years making her feel unwelcome at her own husband's family gatherings. Patricia's perfectly styled hair and expensive jewelry now seemed like props in a performance that had lost all its power to intimidate or impress. James moved toward Maya with the hesitant steps of someone who no longer trusted his ability to command any situation. "Look," he said, his earlier aggression replaced by something approaching humility. "We obviously misunderstood your role in Richard's business, and we're prepared to acknowledge that our treatment of you may have been inappropriate. But surely family relationships matter more than legal technicalities when it comes to preserving what Richard built." Maya studied his face, noting the way his confidence had evaporated when confronted with evidence that challenged his assumptions about power and worthiness. She remembered countless interactions where he had spoken to her, as if she were a child who needed complex matters explained in simple terms, and she felt the last vestiges of her former deference finally disappearing completely. Caroline was crying now, though whether from grief or fear or simple humiliation, Maya couldn't tell. "We never meant to make you feel unwelcome," she said through her tears. "If we had known about your background and your contributions, everything would have been different. Please don't let our ignorance destroy the family relationships that Richard cared so much about preserving." Thompson had positioned himself near the conference room door, his professional instincts clearly focused on ensuring Maya's safety and comfort rather than managing any potential threats she might pose to the family. His transformation from potential escort to protector represented a perfect microcosm of how completely the power dynamics had shifted during the afternoon's revelations. Michael was pacing near the windows, his face reflecting the desperate energy of someone searching for any possible escape from an impossible situation. "There has to be something we can do," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "Some way to work together, some arrangement that protects everyone's interests and maintains the family unity that's always been so important to all of us." Maya walked slowly around the conference table, her movement commanding attention in a way that her presence never had during family gatherings. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the measured authority of someone who had spent years absorbing insults and was now ready to deliver consequences with surgical precision. "For 8 years," she said, her words cutting through their desperation with quiet force, "you made it clear that I was not welcome in discussions about family business, family finances, or family decisions. You dismissed my education, ignored my professional experience, and treated me like a charity case who should be grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance you were willing to offer." Patricia attempted to interrupt, but Maya continued with the unstoppable momentum of someone who had finally found her voice. "Every family dinner where you explained basic financial concepts to me as if I were a child. Every holiday gathering where you made jokes about my background and qualifications. Every business discussion where you suggested I might be more comfortable in another room while the adults talked about important matters." Caroline was sobbing openly now, her earlier arrogance completely replaced by the raw fear of someone who understood that their comfortable world was about to disappear entirely. "We're sorry," she whispered. "We're so very sorry. If we could take back all those moments, all those comments, we would do it in a heartbeat. Please don't punish us for our ignorance and stupidity." Maya looked around the table at faces that had once intimidated her with their casual cruelty and inherited confidence. Now they seemed diminished, reduced to desperate pleading by the revelation that their security had always depended on the competence of someone they had never bothered to understand or respect. "The irony is almost perfect," Maya said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been sadness. "Richard tried to tell you, many times, about my role in our business success. But you were so convinced of your own superiority so certain that someone like me couldn't possibly contribute anything meaningful, that you dismissed his explanations as misguided loyalty to his immigrant wife. James dropped into a chair, his imposing presence finally deflated by the weight of understanding how completely they had misjudged the situation. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happens to us, to our homes, to everything we thought we understood about our place in the world?" Mr. Hawthorne cleared his throat gently, drawing attention back to the legal realities that would determine their futures. "As I mentioned earlier, the bequests to family members represent the extent of their inheritance from Mr. Whitmore's estate," he explained. "The remaining assets belong to Mrs. Nakamura as the surviving partner in Meridian Holdings. Have any of you ever been in a situation where people completely underestimated your abilities or worth? I'd love to hear in the comments how you handled discovering your own strength, especially if you've ever had to prove yourself to people who doubted you from the beginning." Maya moved toward the conference room door, her dignity intact and her authority unquestioned for the first time since she had entered the building that afternoon. Thompson stepped aside respectfully, his professional deference now directed toward someone whose true status he finally understood. Patricia made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of their assumptions. "Maya, please," she called out, her voice breaking with emotion. "We're family. Richard would have wanted us to find a way to work together, to forgive past mistakes, and build something better for the future." Maya paused at the door and turned back toward the table where the Whitmore family sat surrounded by the evidence of their own willful ignorance. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet finality of someone who had made peace with difficult truths. "Richard did want us to be a family," she said, her words carrying both sadness and resolution. "He spent 8 years trying to help you see me as someone worthy of respect and inclusion. But family isn't something you can claim retroactively when it becomes financially advantageous. Family is what you build through daily acts of respect, kindness, and genuine care for each other's well-being." She opened the conference room door and stepped into the hallway, leaving behind a group of people who would spend the rest of their lives learning to live with the consequences of their own arrogance and prejudice. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the building's windows seemed to follow her as she walked away, finally free from the weight of other people's limitations and assumptions about her worth. Behind her, the Whitmores sat in stunned silence, surrounded by documents that told the story of a brilliance they had been too proud to recognize and a generosity they had been too cruel to deserve.